Let's discuss permissions. Understanding permissions, how they work, and how they're set up is critical in ensuring that your site is accessible to your users in the way that it should be. The permission system enables you to control user access to all .cms content and backend functionality through the use of both individual user permissions and roles assigned to each user. Now, we'll discuss basic permissions in this video and some advanced permissions in the next video, but it is highly recommended that all administrators familiarize themselves with each of the documents on our doc site in the permissions section before attempting site-wide permission setup for users or objects. Now, when discussing permissions, let's start simply. I'm here in the site browser. I'm going to navigate to my training folder and the images folder inside of that. Next, I'll right-click on any of the images in this folder. Then I'll click Edit. Here we can see one of the images I've uploaded earlier in the course. Across the top, we can see the tabs we've discussed previously, including the Permissions tab. We've only touched on this briefly, but let's discuss it more in depth. Clicking on the Permissions tab, we can see that this object is currently getting permissions from the parent, which is the site. It's important to understand that all objects should be inheriting permissions from the site, unless we determine that those permissions should be handled individually. Let's go ahead and permission this image individually. To do so, I'll click Permission Individually. And now I can edit my permissions for this image. Here we can see the CMS Anonymous role. The CMS Anonymous role is very important to understand, as this essentially provides access to any users on the front end. This is our public permissions. Normally, we shouldn't modify our CMS anonymous permissions, as editing them might cause some issues for our front end. In this case, I just want to show you how these work. You'll see to the right of our CMS anonymous role in this gray bar, we have 5 columns, most of which have checkboxes. These are the 5 types of permissions we can apply. Firstly, we see View. The View permission allows any user assigned to this role the ability to view this object. Next, we see Add To, which does not have a checkbox. This would normally allow any user assigned to this role to add to this object. Since this object is an image and not something like a folder, we can't add anything to it. Next, we see Edit. This would allow us to edit this object. Next to that, we see Publish. This allows us to publish any changes that we might have made while editing the object. And finally, Edit Permissions, which would allow this user to edit the permissions for this object. It's important to note that these permissions are only assigned to any user assigned to this role. However, we can also add any additional roles or individual users and modify those permissions individually as well. For example, I could click the user dropdown here and choose myself, click Add User, and now I can modify my own user permissions for this object. We could also add other individual roles, like say CMS Owner, click Add Role, and now we could modify the permissions for that role as well. So with this brief explanation, you may already understand how helpful it could be to apply permissions per user or role at the object level, allowing us to adjust whether or not a user or role can view, edit, publish, or add to, or even edit the permissions of a specific object. It's important to note, though, that this could be applied to essentially any object within .cms, not just an image. Now, if I made some changes that I don't want to keep, I can just hit Reset Permissions. If I did want to keep the changes I made, I would hit Apply Changes. In this case, I don't want to save any of the changes I've made, so I'll hit Reset Permissions. Then I'll click OK. And now we're right back to receiving those permissions from our parent. These permissions were inherited, and we'll talk more about that later on. Now that we've seen what it looks like to alter permissions for this object, let's go back by clicking the X in the top right corner. Now let's take a look at permissions for something different. Let's look at our folder. Let's right-click on the training folder and click Edit Folder. Here, once again, we see the tabs we discussed previously, and now we can click Permissions. Once again, we can see that this folder is inheriting permissions from the parent, which is the site. We can see our CMS anonymous role and our 5 columns. However, things are about to look a bit different. Let's click Permission individually. Now what we see is a matrix of our permissions. Again, we can add new roles or new users, but when looking at our CMS anonymous role and the permissions to the right of it, we also have multiple child objects listed below. This matrix allows us to adjust the permissions for each of these individual child objects within this folder. We can see a brief explanation saying, select what permissions CMS Anonymous will have on the following children. Those children are folders, pages, links, content type, content files, and rules. It's important to note the distinction between these children objects and the folder itself. The gray bar that we saw previously represents the object we're currently looking at. This bar that states CMS Anonymous represents this folder, the training folder. So if I were to check or uncheck View in this gray bar, that means I can now no longer view the training folder. If I check or uncheck Add To, I can control whether or not we can add to this folder. You may have already noticed that the permission types do affect one another. For instance, if I wanted to uncheck View, that also unchecks the Add To box, because if I can't view this folder, well, then I can't add to it either. If I wanted to check the Edit box, you'll notice that View and Add To are also checked. Following that logic, it's easy to understand why these boxes are checked or unchecked automatically. However, again, the checkboxes on this gray bar relate only to this object we are currently editing. The boxes below affect the children within that object. So, when we see folders, this row is indicating any folders that may exist within this folder. If we didn't want to allow CMS Anonymous to view any folders within the training folder, but we did want them to view the training folder, then we could just uncheck the folders child. Once again, these checkboxes do relate to one another. If I check Edit on the folders, it also checks Add To. It's important to note that any of the changes we make here to the permissions of this object or any other objects on our site will have a significant impact on how users interact with our content. We really need to ensure that we fully understand the changes that we're making and the impact they will have. This is why having a plan for your permissions is so important, to ensure that your permissions will be mapped out appropriately and work exactly the way that you want them to. So now we understand that we can edit the permissions for this object within this role and for any of the children within this object for that same role. You'll notice we also have another role here, the contributor role. This was created previously, and if I click on it, I'll actually expand that very same matrix, but this time all of the selections here will affect the contributor role only. You'll notice it says select what permissions contributor will have on the following children. It's important to ensure that you're selecting the appropriate role when making these permissions changes. So, now we understand that changes can be made at the object level, and if that object has children, that we can affect the permissions for the children within that object as well. However, let's take a look at another way of affecting permissions. Let's click on Settings, and then Roles and Tools. Here we can see any roles within our system. You'll see that I can expand any one of these categories. Let's expand System. One thing to note about these groups is that they're actually roles. This system role contains these roles within it as children. Something else to note here is the CMS administrator role. If a user is assigned the CMS administrator role, they can essentially do almost anything within .cms, such as accessing any content or object, taking any action, and doing so on any site. This is true even if the CMS administrator role is not explicitly assigned to that content, object, action, or site. If you want a user to have more limited permissions than that, you'll have to create a custom administrator role and assign the specific permissions you want to that role. There are only two things the CMS administrator cannot do. One, log in as another user. Now, they still can log in as another user, but they must also be assigned the login as role. And two, they cannot save velocity code, which contains the SQL tool velocity view tool. To be able to do that, they must also assign the scripting user role. So you'll see the CMS administrator role is extremely powerful, but still has some limitations which require you to also assign additional roles. These are all of our system roles. I can select any one of these roles, like our CMS anonymous role we discussed previously, and I can edit the permissions for this role by going to the Permissions tab. Here I can modify the permissions for the role and how it affects all of the sites that that role is related to. However, again, it's important that we don't modify our CMS anonymous role, at least not without fully understanding what those changes could mean. Instead, let's minimize our system and create a new role. If I click the blue plus sign in the top right corner, I can add a new role. Now, I want to point something out here. Clicking that plus sign, when I did, after selecting our CMS anonymous role, is creating this role as a child of the CMS anonymous role. Any selections we make when searching through our roles on the left-hand side is selecting that role or group of roles. So it's important to make sure you've chosen the appropriate role or group of roles, or that your filters are cleared out entirely if you're trying to create that role at the root level. If I click the X in the top corner and click Clear next to our filter bar, then click the blue plus sign and add role once again, you'll see that now our parent is root role, meaning this does not have a parent. This role exists simply at the root. Let's go ahead and create a new role at the root. We'll call this Training. Next, we'll see the key field. This key becomes extremely important when integrating with an external system, such as single sign-on providers. You'll see how we reference this key later on, but we need to ensure that our key is a unique value and that we keep close attention on exactly what this key is. Again, we'll use training. However, it may be helpful to use something a bit more unique that wouldn't have a likelihood of being confused with something else. When we integrate with an external system, it's helpful to prefix this key with something like .cms to make it clear to the administrators of that external system what system these roles are granting users to. Then again, we can see the parent, and below that, we can see can grant. Essentially, if we want to allow users to be assigned to this role, we would check the users box. If we would like permissions to be edited for this role, then we would check the permissions box. And lastly, if we want to be able to edit the tools available for this role, then we check the toolbox. Finally, we can provide a basic description of our role and the intended usage of that role. Next, we'll click Save. We've now created a new role at the root level. Now, you may notice I can expand this, however, there's nothing within our training role yet. However, the other roles that we have here, such as System, include roles within them. So we can create roles within our roles and essentially group our roles into logical groups so that we can control how those roles work. This has more to do with inheritance, which again we'll talk about more later. Now let's click on Training and modify the permissions of our new role. Here we can see the Permissions tab is selected, and we can see the permissions for all sites. However, if we scroll back up, we'll see the option to add a site or folder, where we can individually apply permissions to different sites or folders, similarly to how we could modify the permissions for different roles within an object. In this case, let's just continue looking at all sites. Here we once again see our matrix. We see our 5 types of permissions, and now we see all of the possible objects that we could have permissions for, including sites, folders, containers, templates, template layouts, pages, links, content types, content files, categories, and rules. Just as before, we can choose which children we would like our role to be able to view, add children to, edit, publish, or edit permissions. In this case, you'll notice that most of these will require us to modify them individually. Now, it's very atypical that we would add permissions for all sites. Instead, we would usually go ahead, choose a specific host, and set permissions for that host. Let's choose our proservetraining.cms.site. This is where we've been working on our demo site. I'll select that from the dropdown and click Add. Now we see that site listed here. And now you'll notice I can apply those permissions to the site itself, selecting all of the children within. Now there's an important rule of thumb when it comes to permissions at object levels. When we're looking at our host or system folders, essentially the only permissions we usually want to apply would be view permissions. So we can check the view box and then scroll to the bottom and click Apply Changes. You may, however, notice this Cascade Changes box. It's very important that you understand what this means before you ever consider clicking it. You'll notice there's a question mark right next to that. As it says, checking this option will replicate the same set of permissions you're currently setting for the role to all other assets under this site or folder that are not inheriting permissions. This will essentially wipe out any permissions for any children within this role and replace them with what we're currently applying. There are times in which this may be useful, but more often than not, you don't want to cascade your changes. So make sure you're very aware of how to use this and when. Now, once you've cascaded changes, there is no way to restore any permissions that you overwrote. So, it's best practice that even if you think you may need to cascade changes, try first making the change without cascading. If that doesn't work, then you can come back and cascade the change later. Once again, you can find more about this in our documentation site. Now that we've checked the view box, let's just click Apply Changes. So we have applied our permissions to our training role on our ProServe-training site and allowed this role to view the site. Now, I would like to point out, if I uncheck View and Apply Changes, you'll notice that our ProServe-training site is removed from this role's site permissions. If we don't have any permissions applied, then it essentially just removes that site or object from the permissions. Now let's add our site back in. Again, I'll make sure I have it chosen on the dropdown, and I'll click Add. I'll check the view box and click Apply Changes. I do also want to point out, when we click the dropdown, we see our sites, but we can expand any one of these and actually direct it to a specific folder. I could choose my training folder, for instance, and add permissions just for that folder here. Now, this training folder is a pretty high-level folder. It is applied essentially right at the root. Now that we've added our training folder, we can apply permissions changes to that folder and to any of the children within it, just like we discussed before. So, looking at it here is just like when we right-clicked on the folder and modified the permissions there. It's just performing those changes in two different places. Now, let's go ahead and apply some of those changes that we talked about. Let's check the box for view on the folder, and then we'll check the folders box, pages, links, content types, content/files, and in this case, we won't check rules. Usually, allowing our users to access the rules is only reserved for very high-level users. Then we'll go ahead and also allow Add Children. This is the same as our Add To checkbox. We'll again check that for folders. And then when it comes to edit, we don't want to allow this role to edit the folder itself. We want to leave that folder as it is. So we won't check the edit box at the folder level. However, we will check the edit box for our children. We'll choose folders, pages, links, content types, and content/files. Finally, we have the ability to publish. Do we want this role to publish these items? Sure. They can publish pages, links, content types, and content files. But again, we'll leave the rules out of it. Then we'll apply our changes. And now we have changed some permissions for this role at this folder level. Now, it's important to note that these permissions can be different for the site itself and for the folder. We want to ensure that we are setting this appropriately at the appropriate level. So make sure that we're paying close attention to our permissions, how we're applying them, and once we have applied them, it's very helpful to go and test those permissions. As long as you have login as permissions for your own user, you can click the icon in the top right corner, choose login as, and test a user that has been applied to that role. Once we make changes to permissions in a role or in an object, it's important to note that these changes do occur in the background. We'll be able to take other actions right away, but it may take some time for the changes to propagate. So, if you look at the permissions of an affected object or piece of content quickly, it may still show those old permissions. However, usually when the changes are complete, you'll get a message in the notification area at the top right of the app. Now, speaking of which, we would need to go to our Users tab and add users to this training role. Now, normally you may think, hey, we have to go in and add these users individually every single time we add a new user. However, .cms works directly with Active Directory and allows you to essentially ingest new users through the roles added to Active Directory. Again, you can learn a lot more about this on our docs site, but it's important to note that this essentially allows your users to be set it and forget it. Once you add the user in Active Directory, it will go ahead and add that user to your .cms instance and apply the appropriate roles. So, let's choose someone to give these permissions to. Now, I could go ahead and add my own account to this role. However, it's important to note that my user account already exists in a role with a much higher level of permissions, meaning it can access a lot more than this training role allows. What that means is everything that this training role sets would essentially be usurped by this higher level permissions role. Whatever roles you're a part of, the highest level of permissions will always take priority. So keep that in mind, that if users are added to multiple roles, well, if there's a higher level of permissions in one of those roles, those will take precedence. So I could add myself to this role, but it wouldn't really make any difference. However, I will go ahead and add, say, Daniel Publisher to this role. I'll click Grant, and now the user has been assigned to this role. Now I could check the box next to Daniel Publisher, click Remove, click OK, and now the user has been removed from the role. It's that simple. So now we know how to create a new role, apply permissions, and add users to that role. Let's take a look at one more thing we can do here. Let's look at the Tools tab. In the Tools tab, we'll see all of the tool groups that are accessible to the users within our site. Here, we can choose which tool groups we would like this role to have access to. So let's choose some relevant tool groups like Site, Content, and Media. Then we'll go ahead and choose Save. And now we've saved this tool configuration for this role. This is important as well, as again, we don't necessarily want every role to have access to things like our dev tools or our settings. We only want to choose what is relevant or helpful for them working within .cms. Now that we've set our tool groups for this role, let's talk about the user side. We've already added a user to this role, but now let's take a look at the users themselves and see how we can view those roles. If I click on Users under Settings, I can find my Daniel Publisher user, and here in my tabs across the top, I can see roles. Here I can see that this user has been granted the training role. I could select the training role and click on the arrows to the left to move it back to roles to grant, meaning that this no longer has this role. Or I could choose another role from the left-hand side and add it to the right, and save my changes if I wish. This is another way to grant a user a role. You'll see that it's easy to grant multiple roles here if we wish. You'll also notice a Permissions tab here. In this case, once again, we can apply permissions to the user level. Much like when we were applying permissions for specific roles or users at the folder or the site level, here we can once again choose a site or folder or apply permissions changes to all sites and the objects within them. While we're here in the user's screen, it's important to note a few things about back-end users. If we want a user to be able to access the back-end, firstly, they of course need a user. If the user doesn't exist, then we can't provision them for the back-end. Then the user also needs the back-end user role. This will be assigned automatically by checking the back-end user box under Access on the User Details tab. Finally, at least one role must be assigned that has at least one tool group assigned to it. If no tools are assigned to the user through the roles, they won't be able to use the back-end at all. So, now that we've created a new role, added a user to it, and applied some changes to the permissions, let's go ahead and ensure that those changes did appropriately take effect and that they work exactly as we want them to. To check this, all we need to do is click on our user icon in the top right. Then choose Log In As. Here we can choose a user from the dropdown to log in as that user and test. In this case, I'll click Daniel Publisher. This is the user that we added to the role we just created. We'll click Change, and now I'm viewing the site as that user. You'll notice that I can see my site, content, and media tool groups. However, you may also notice I can see the content model tool group. This is likely because of another role that this user was already a part of. But let's go ahead and expand our site and go to the browser. Here we can see our training images folder. So we know we have access to the training folder and the children within the training folder. If I right-click on training though, you'll notice I cannot modify the training folder because I did not give this role edit permissions on the training folder. If I right-click on images, however, I can modify the images folder. Here I could add new content, and I could modify existing content if I wish. Once again, it's extremely important to log in as a user and test any new roles or permissions changes we may have applied while working in .cms. Once we're done testing and ensuring that our changes have been applied, we can click on the user icon in the top right once more and choose Log Out As. Now there's one more thing we'll discuss during this video, and that is locking roles. If I go to my settings and back to my roles and tools, I have my training role, just like we created a moment ago. If I right-click on the training role, I'll see an option to lock this role. Locking the role will ensure that no one can make permissions changes to the role until it has been unlocked. Locked roles are roles whose permissions are inherited regardless of individual settings or inheritance. They allow for us to create global task-based roles, which are especially important in a multi-host or multi-tenant type environment. Roles and role permissions can be locked from this page here by right-clicking on the role and clicking Lock Role.